Shabbat Shalom, everyone. This week's Torah portion is called Re'eh because the word Re'eh is the first word that we encounter. And Re'eh means see. But it doesn't just mean to see, to look. It means see. Do you get it? Do you understand? And I always like the opening of this week's portion because we have the same way in English of asking if we understand an issue, a question, if we know what we're looking at, and we can be looking physically or mentally. We can be seeing not only with our eyes, but with our heads, our minds, and our hearts. And that is exactly how this week's Torah portion begins. See, do you get it? See what is at stake here if you follow the mitzvot, if you follow the teachings of the Torah, how you will succeed in life, how you will create a society that works, that is just and kind and compassionate. And also in this portion, that idea is carried through in an issue of economics. Uh, God says there should not be, there shall not be anyone who is poor or needy amongst you. But if there is, so the ideal is that everyone should be self sufficient, but the reality is that there are always people in a community who are not able to be self sufficient. And it is an act of holiness on the community level, not just on the individual level, but on the community level, on the covenant level, to see that the needy are taken care of and taken care of with dignity. And that you really should not think about all kinds of other circumstances that might allow you an excuse not to be supportive. So, this idea of economic justice does not mean that no one should be wealthy. It doesn't mean that it's a bad thing to be successful. It just means that when you have success, when you have resources, in addition to being grateful, as we saw in last week's portion, you should use your resources for the good of the community. That is an act of holiness. And while it may sound like it is a condition of God's blessing that we use our resources for the benefit of the whole community, it is, but at the same time, the covenant is eternal and enduring. And our Haftarah portion this week brings that home because the book of Isaiah talks to us about what it was like after the Babylonian conquest when the Israelites were exiled, when they were punished, and how they suffered, not just materially, but spiritually. And we have this dual message that when you behave well, you will prosper materially and spiritually. And if you do not behave well, you will fail, not only materially, but also spiritually. And yet, the consequences of that bad behavior, when you are conquered, when you fail and are miserable, are poor, when you have lost everything, still the covenant endures, and God, like a parent who administers punishment, God will redeem the Israelites. God will redeem the Jewish people from their suffering and bring them back and care for them and watch over them. Us. That it is a matter of ultimate justice within our covenant, that while we do what we can in this world, to live well, to live a life of holiness and mindfulness about God's presence and God's blessings in the sense of the gifts of our abilities, our talents, our skills. It is how we use those skills that will make a difference in our immediate daily lives in this world. And at the same time, if we turn away from holiness, there will be ultimately an end to a time of punishment and an end to feeling helpless and abandoned, because God will redeem. God will come back, watch over us, redeem us, and we will not be in want. And the promises that Isaiah makes, that when people who are our enemies use their tools and their talents for ill and for evil, they will not ultimately succeed because of the covenant between God and the Jewish people. And particularly as we sit 3 weeks after Tisha B'Av and therefore 4 weeks before Rosh Hashanah, as we begin to examine our lives, how have we been a holy people? How have we been persons who hold ourselves to a high standard of caring, of concern, of sharing, of building community and reaching out? How are we doing? And do we see ourselves not just as under God's protection or under God's punishing thumb, but do we see ourselves as partners in carrying this message of morality, of compassion? Do we see ourselves as partners, that what we do makes a difference, not just to God, but in the world? And Isaiah reassures us that yes, it does. And that no matter how bad things are in the present moment, they will get better. That we may be holding on to God's hand less as partners and more as the needy, the spiritually needy in the world. We still are holding God's hand, and God is holding our hands. The Torah thinks about the immediate in the sense of how do you live your life every day? How do you relate to your neighbors? How do you treat the people in your life? But also, in the long run, who are we as a people? And who do we want to be? We have choices. God is always clear that we have the choices to use our talents for good or ill, to be loving, or to withhold our love. And when we are oppressed and persecuted, we still have choices. Do we hang our heads in shame and feel powerless? Or do we still hold our heads up in faith? And after all these thousands of years, I think we can say that holding our heads up, maintaining our connection to Judaism, to this covenant that is especially ours with God, that has enabled us to survive with a distinctive identity, with a message for our own selves, for our neighbors and friends and families, and for the world. This covenant is very much a covenant that entails responsibility on our part, but also responsibility on God's part. And we are with it together for the long haul. And we still are. When we read the news, when we read the news of events in Jewish communities all over the world, when we read the news of events in Israel, we still have this sense that that is something we are involved in because we are part of the Jewish people. And Judaism reaches back to the time of Torah through the time of the prophets, right to this very day, to say, this is an unbreakable thread. So as you read and study, as you do your best to see, to really see what's going on below the surface, around you in the world, in the long haul of history, do your best to really see what really matters. That this covenant, these standards and values of how to live, make a difference in both the short term and the long term. May this vision be with you. May it inform your choices, your decisions. May it inform your life. And may it be a blessing. And may you be a blessing for all who know you and in everything you do. Shabbat Shalom.